Good afternoon. I'm Lilian Ferrari from Rio de Janeiro Federal University. Welcome to Abralin ao Vivo, Linguistics Online. This project is organized by the Brazilian Linguistics Association, Abralin, in cooperation with the Permanent International Committee of Linguists, the Latin American Association of Linguistics and Philology, AUFAL, the Argentine Society of Linguistic Studies, the LSA, Linguistic Society of America, and the Linguistics Association of Great Britain. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce a very special guest, Professor Mark Turner. He received his PhD from University of California, Berkeley, and he is an institute professor and professor of cognitive science at Case Western Reserve University. He is the founding director of the Cognitive Science Network and co-director of the Red Hen Lab, a laboratory for big data and multimodal communication. Over the years, Professor Turner is under many honors, including the Annelies Meyer Research Prize from the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, and the winner of the Prix du rayonnement de la langue et de la littérature française from the French Academy. He is also founding president of the Meyerfield Institute for Cognition and the Arts. He authored and co-authored several books, including Death is the Mother of Beauty, Mind, Metaphor, and Criticism, Reading Minds, the Study of English in the Age of Cognitive Science, The Literary Minds, The Origins of Thought and Language, The Origin of Ideas, Blending Creativity and the Human Spark, Clear and Simple as the Truth, Writing Class Prose with Francis Noel Thomas, and More Than Cool Reason, A Field Guide to Poetic Metaphor with George Lakoff. Turner and Gilles Fauconnier developed the theory of conceptual blending and co-authored the book The Way We Think, The Mind's Hidden Complexities. And today, he'll talk about conceptual blending as a central process of grammar, language, and communication. Mark, thank you for joining us today. And now the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Lillian and Miguel. I especially want to thank Abralin for running this fantastic series in our difficult times. For me, it's been just wonderful. That is, I have been able to attend to innovations and new research by friends and colleagues and marvelous researchers around the world whom I haven't talked to in 18 months or 2 years. And there they are, pouring their heart out for all of us, telling us what their labs have done lately. And we are also seeing a worldwide conversation, including not just headliners, but up and coming meteoric talents. And we are now able to see this in the world exactly because Abralin, in conjunction with all of these other organizations, is put in a tremendous amount of work and art in order to bring this to us. It also means that these things are recorded. And so now when I'm lecturing, I can say, well, if you want to hear about that subject, just go to Abralin ao Vivo on YouTube and listen to that. Listen to that lecture. So we owe you a great debt. Now, the topic for today is human linguistic abilities, right? What are they? What are they? What is their source? Now, we can always stipulate them. And this is what we've done for thousands of years. We can say, children have the ability to learn language, or people can express themselves. Other people can understand them. This is true. But it takes out a huge loan on theory. Why can they do that, right? And how do we pay down that loan? So this talk is about the sources of language, phylogenetically and ontogenetically. How do we pay down that loan? How do we explore the particular question of the mental abilities that make it possible for human beings to do this? Now, it's particularly difficult because although we are on a gradient with other communicative species, and I often give lectures about the kinds of communications that other species can do, humpback whales, New Zealand rooks, dogs, they're wonderful stuff, kanzi. There is no robust animal model for human performance. Human beings are communicative like many species, but they're really, really off the charts, and we don't find a model for this in the wild. Now, at the International Conference on Cognitive Linguistics in Japan, a little while ago, the last one, Nick Infeld gave a keynote lecture, and I took a picture of his slide, in which he explained that the first commitment of cognitive linguistics is to try to ground language, if you can, in more general cognition instead of language-specific cognition. And that's exactly my claim. I'm going to claim that language is grounded in blending, also known as conceptual integration. This doesn't mean that you don't have to have a whole lot besides. Of course you do. Attention, memory, vision. Indeed, in an embodied cognitive linguistics, you need a tremendous amount that's already in place before blending, the evolution of blending, the development of blending to the level that we see in our species makes it possible to use all those other capacities, all those other mental abilities, to turn to the focus of language. Now, almost everything that I'm going to talk about here is based in a collaboration with brilliant linguist Gilles Fauconnier. You can find us on the web. You can find us in this book. That is, of course, Gilles on the right. And you can also have a look at The Literary Mind, The Origins of Thought and Language, which I published in 1996. Now, The Literary Mind goes through basic mental operations, and it shows them at work in a general sense across a great range of human performances, human singularities, art, music, religion, mathematical insight, scientific discovery, fashion, advanced social cognition, advanced tool use. Yes, other species do these things, and indeed they do many things we can't. I can't fly. I can't even photosynthesize. The genome of the Norwegian spruce tree is 7 times bigger than mine. So this is not a great chain of being story with human beings at the top. On the contrary, we're quite feeble in many ways, and other species excel. But in this way, we are at the top of the gradient. That is true. In the very last chapter of that book, I come to language. And I make the claims in 1996, essentially, that I'm going to claim here, although there has been some development over 25 years. I hope there would be. In that chapter, I talk about the ways in which these mental abilities, these mental operations, which are not uniquely linguistic, make it possible for us to have language. I pursue these mental abilities and their analysis in many other kinds of behavior, in many other kinds of books, as you can see. But the story is on human linguistic abilities. How can we begin to account for them, including the ones that we've just stipulated? Well, my focus today is going to be the role of blending, also known as conceptual integration, as a source for human linguistic ability. Now, there are other kinds of ways in which we could look for sources. So in this series, David Popel gave a brilliant talk in which he used brain imaging to analyze rhythms and the ways in which rhythms of speech and rhythms of brains coordinate, and he cited many other species and so on. It's really excellent programs of study and research, which I praise. And in fact, in the appendix to the Origin of Ideas, I go through all the proposals that there might be for some kind of neurobiological substrate for blending. And there are some. So, for instance, there have been people who talk about the little love peanut that when you do projecting human properties onto inanimate beings, it's conceptual blending. And in fact, you see, depending on the environment, you either get an N400 spike or not. And there are lots of other ways to try to analyze this. Broker neurons, hypertrophies of perceptual integration, hypertrophies of domain-specific blends like chase play, in which the mother becomes both the predator and the mother, right? I criticize these, saying that, you know, there are problems with all of them. I go through a number of them. You can have a look if you like. Point is that I think there's a very, very long way to go in looking for any sort of neurobiological substrate, exactly because, as far as research is able to show, conceptual blending happens over all content domains. So if you were to ask where in the neocortex you might see blending happening, the answer is everywhere. And it is not costly for cognitively modern human beings. Happens all the time. So if you were to ask when would you pick up conceptual blending in the human neocortex, the answer is all the time. So everywhere and all the time makes me think that at the moment, so far with our crude brain imaging techniques, which I admire, sometimes use, we don't have a handle yet on trying to pick out neurobiological processes of blending. But you can see the review of those who tried in the appendix to The Origin of Ideas. Now, there are other ways to stipulate. Michael Tomasello gave a brilliant talk in this series. I really have loved this series on June 8th, in which he talked about communication before language. And he stipulates that human beings have a certain kind of theory of mind, a certain kind of social cognition that makes it possible for them to understand complicated uses of pointing and so on. Wonderful data from small children and other species and so on. And in fact, I think this is a terrific way to go. In The Origin of Ideas, I compare Michael Tomasello's theories of the origin of language with those of Fauconnier and Turner. And in fact, what I say is that you certainly do need the capacities that Tomasello stipulates, but we'd like to make some progress in accounting for where they come from. And the blending is actually the major instrument making this concept of another mind, a rich concept of another mind, possible. And so that book says that Tomasello's proposals and the blending hypothesis are not opposed. And in fact, when I was associate director of the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences, I invited Michael Tomasello to a workshop in 2003 on emergence, and I asked him about this. And at the time, 17 years ago, I've seen him many times since. At the time, he said that he didn't object, that as long as we kept the part in blending that provides this advanced social cognition, then he had what he needed in order to tell a good evolutionary story. So these are sort of compatible, I think. Now, if we look at a little further afield, Steven Pinker gave a brilliant talk a few days ago here. And before I say what I'm going to say, I should say that I owe Steven Pinker a great debt. He wrote a book called on style, and he published a large article in College English on it, in which he said that his conception of effective science writing was based in a book that I wrote with Francis Noel Thomas called Clear and Simple as the Truth. He called it a brilliant little book, and my publisher, Princeton University Press, immediately slapped that blurb onto the cover, and sales of the book rose by a factor of 15. So thank you, Steven Pinker. And additionally, I invited him when I was running a program at the Getty Research Institute in Brentwood to come and participate. He did so admirably. I invited him to give a talk at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences. And he and I have been on panels at the National Humanities Center for days. The Getty Research Project produced The Artful Mind. So I'm delighted to have Steven Pinker in this series, and I owe him a debt. But in fact, I should say that 8th chapter on language in the literary mind is exceptionally critical of both Noam Chomsky and Steven Pinker and many others like Paul Bloom and so on, claiming that the evolutionary story in particular in natural language and natural selection was deeply flawed, and naming Pinker on the first page and going through it. And for decades, I've been running this set of slides on universal grammar, including a review of Pinker and Jackendorf talking about the minimalist program, and saying that I would never say conceptual blending is universal grammar. What I would say is the operation of conceptual blending is part of a non-uniquely linguistic universal grammar. And part of this story is that human beings are bent on developing language. As I say, if you have a child and you have a frog, there's almost nothing you can do to stop the child from developing language if you're in anything like a human environment, and there's nothing you can do for the frog. No one has ever doubted that human beings are biologically constituted to develop language abilities. The question has always been, to what extent do linguistic abilities derive from non-exclusively linguistic mental operations? Well, these days, I think maybe I was a little uncharitable to Steven Pinker, because these first two things I've just said are just the things that Steven Pinker says, or so I interpret him. In fact, a few days ago, he said that instinct, why did he call it the language instinct? He said, instinct is a vague term. It doesn't have many commitments in it. It lets us pursue the question of empirically what is native or not, what is linguistic or not. He's been quite favorable toward cognitive linguistics and embodied views and the stuff of thought. In his 2013 second edition of Learnability and Cognition, he talks about his deep reliance on the work of Lynn Talmy, and says, in retrospect, it was wise of me to remain more or less agnostic in my choice of grammatical formalisms, because the reigning grammatical theory of the time, Noam Chomsky's government and binding, has been discarded by its erstwhile proponents, and its successor, the minimalist program, has offered little new insight into the relationship between lexical semantics and argument structure, or, Jackendorf and I have argued, into anything else. And he has also said that he adopts an approach pretty much like construction grammar. Now, these are new times. I'm very pleased to report. We go back to Nick Enfield's slide. We would like to see to what extent language is founded on non-language specific cognition. And that accords certainly with Michael Tomasello. But you understand, there was a time when Steven Pinker published The Language Instinct, and Michael Tomasello immediately published a very critical review called Language is Not an Instinct. So to have them sort of, to think that blending theory might, to some extent, be more widely accepted is a bit of a surprise. To me, it had faced extraordinary opposition when it first came out. There are, of course, many other linguists that I would cite who have been sympathetic to it. I hope all of them will forgive me for not going through the long list. You know them all. And in fact, many of them were covered a few days ago in Lilian Ferrari and Mayra Avelar's presentation on cognitive linguistics, where is it and where it is going. So perhaps blending theory has become much more mainstream in linguistics. And in fact, Ronald Lanneker is somebody I should really cite here. So I'm currently not doing the full screen version of my talk, but we'll just do that. I wrote an article that's in press right now. It's not published, but you can download it from my website. And in that article, I reviewed much of what we've got going on here. And what I wrote was, within cognitive functional approaches to language, there are repeated presentations of processes of language that look much like blending. The most prominent and thorough of these theories is cognitive grammar. And then I give a long review of the ways in which cognitive grammar, Ronald Lanneker's cognitive grammar, has many analyses of very precise phenomena that are utterly compatible with blending theory. Not that blending theory subsumes or takes credit for any of these great analyses that all these brilliant linguists have done. And I write that it may be that Lanneker and other cognitive and functional linguists would agree, no doubt with illumination or objection, and only to a certain extent, that such analyses presuppose general cognitive mechanisms, not specific to language, and indeed the chief one they presuppose is blending. And I thought, well, I'll just send this article to Ron. So I sent it to Ron and said, Ron, what do you think? And he wrote back. And so this is a personal communication, but he gave me permission to publish it in the article. So you can find it in that article, which you can download from my website, markturner.org. And he wrote, I fully agree that cognitive grammar, quote, analyses presuppose general cognitive mechanisms not specific to language, then indeed the chief one they presuppose is blending. Not a big surprise. I've long taken it for granted, he says, that conceptual and grammatical structures can be characterized in terms of mappings between mental spaces, and in particular that composition amounts to bipolar blending. This conforms to my traditional description that component structures are integrated to form the composite whole. Perhaps because it is so evident, I have not made the connection to conceptual integration theory as explicit as I perhaps should have done. Here is one succinct statement in composition. Component structures undergo conceptual integration to form a composite structure that is more than just the sum of its parts. And he gives some other sort of examples. And if you would like to review more of this and all these linguists, you can look at the presentation by Lilian Ferrari and Maida Avelar from a few days ago. And one thing I want to make clear is that when I say blending theory seems to be becoming somewhat more mainstream linguistics, that I am not trying to plant the flag and proclaim dominion. I think it's a good idea for science and the science of language to look at this basic mental operation, which is in its infancy. And I look forward to the participation of anybody. Now, so let's look a little bit at construction grammar and blending theory and some of the specifics of linguistics just to give a taste. I'll start with the idea that knowing a communicative system is knowing a relational network of form-meaning pairs and how they blend. First, you have to make the form-meaning pairs. Some few of those may be genetic. Other species have some. But human beings can make a tremendous number of form-meaning pairs and a tremendous number of constructions, we call them. But then you also have to blend the construction into an actual performance. And that performance can include voice, gaze, co-speech, gesture, viewpoint, material anchors, and so on. So what do we need in order to account for language? Well, there are central problems. We have to create some basic form-meaning pairs, constructions, simple one being lexical, like food. However, the number of these constructions that you can make is complicated and diverse, is nonetheless quite small compared to human construction of meaning. And so you need an interesting ability, an all-important tipping point. That is, you have to be able to use a limited number of constructions, form-meaning pairs, to express yourself about almost anything. And you need to be able to do that in such a way that you don't need always to invent new constructions when you want to say some new meaning. You have to have equipotentiality of your linguistic capacities. I'll talk about that in just a second. You also have to be able to take your constructions and blend them into an actual performance, into an actual expression, so that the hearer, on seeing that performance, can think, not consciously, what constructions do I have which, if blended properly, would have produced this performance? And then they have that network, and that is the network that guides them to construe the meaning. Words do not mean, expressions do not mean, constructions do not mean. They are form-meaning pairs. That is, we see the form, we see the performance, and it prompts us to construct meaning based on the network of form-meaning pairs that we assemble in order to account for the performance that we have just seen. There's, of course, astounding cultural and regional variation in these linguistic systems and performances, and highly flexible and creative common mental operations. We have to have these mental abilities for creating form-meaning pairs, for blending form-meaning pairs, for making new form-meaning pairs with old ones as inputs. Yes, there are sometimes new constructions. We have to have a theory that explains how that happens, or adopts a commitment to explain it. We need these mental abilities for the phylogenetic origin of language, and we also needed to account for the ontogenetic acquisition of language. Now, the other way of looking at it, the other main one, tends to say, well, there are traits, and there are just a bunch of them. And I am taking the opposite view that no, human beings, like other species, had a lot in place, and that blending per se goes back, as far as I know, to early mammals. But there was a development in the blending ability on this cline, and you get to a certain spot, and that spot is double scope blending. And once you get to that, you can precipitate a number of human singularities that, in fact, scaffold each other, help each other, support each other. No one of them, like language or tool use or social cognition, was the one that made it possible to have all the others. No, they all come up pretty much roughly together. We see this, it looks that way evolutionarily, it looks that way in the development of the child. Similarly, there's another way of sort of dividing things up when we look at human linguistic abilities. There are these long lists of figures of thought, figures of language. There are hundreds of them. They have Greek names because they've been around for thousands of years. And human beings are nominalists, existentially. That is, we think if we have a word for something that it exists. So we have a word for dog, we think there must be dogs. That's kind of dangerous because these words are just little labels. They're not theories. They're not analyses. They're not experiments. They're not inferences. They're just labels. They're shorthand. They're forms that we use to try to get people to put together some kind of meaning. And there's an additional step which sometimes takes the form of thinking, well, we have a word metaphor. This must be a metaphor. And then to assume that there's a part of the brain or a system in the brain that makes that kind of thing. So we talk about symbolic thinking or metaphoric thinking or metonymic thinking, right? And in order to pursue this, usually we look at extremely simple things, like, Juliet is the sun, or Paris has joined the phone call, or very simple things, and try to pick out some differences between them, and then assume that these are different modes of thought. I think that's a mistake. That is sort of like taxonomies and classifications before the theory of evolution. That is, you could say, here's a leaf with 1 point, here's a leaf with 3, here's a leaf with 5. But we don't think that there's a system behind this that sometimes there's not a system to produce a 1 point leaf, and then a different system that produces a 3 point leaf, and a different system that produces a 5 point leaf. On the contrary, these surface differences are just the tip of the iceberg, and the content covers only a small amount of data. When we look at actual human performance, we see all these things going on all the time because, I claim, there is an integrated system behind them that results in all these different 1 or 3 or 5 point artifacts. They're products, not systems of thought. So I've been arguing this for a long time. In 1988, I published an article saying that categorical thinking and analogical thinking is not fundamentally different. On the contrary, they're using the same mental operations, but of course there are differences in the surface products, and here's how they come about. That was met with a considerable amount of criticism. In a book that I published with Christina Cacciari, Ray Gibbs, and Albert Katz, I have one of 4 chapters. It's called Figure, and it reviews the history of theory about figures of thought and figures of language, and why we should be looking for a theory that, instead of separating these as processes, in fact views them as sometimes somewhat different products of a unified system, such that they work together all the time. That's what really happens if you look at actual human language. And when you do look at even at the products, you're going to find all of this blending involved. So most of the things that we think of as metaphors have links in the network that are, for the most part, not metaphoric, and they have a lot of other links besides. So Nick Infield's slide, again, cognitive linguistics, here we go. We are looking for more general cognition, and the one I'm looking at is blending, conceptual integration. An example of hidden blending, that is stuff that people don't ever notice. I usually use pyrotechnic examples so people can see what's going on. Things like the Buddhist monk or the mythic race. The problem with those is, although they're effective pedagogically, they tend to make people think that blending is exceptional and that you notice it when it happens. On the contrary, 99.999% blending is never noticed. It's all important, but it's not noticed. It's just what a human brain does all day long, all the time. It is not costly for human brains. On the contrary, if you're anything like a human being in anything like a human situation, you're going to be using it all the time to develop exactly what you need. But notice in your experience of time, the day, no day ever repeats. There's a day, and then there's another day, and another day, and another day, and another day. Far too many to keep in mind, far too many to grasp. You have to compress them, which we do by blending. We compress all the days to the day, and we compress the differences in those days to change. Now, this is selective projection, but it's also emergent structure, because notice that the cyclic day repeats. We can say when the day comes around again. No, actual day comes around again, even in movies like Groundhog Day, where the fantasy is that the day repeats. The events of the day don't actually repeat. Just the opening scene repeats. But now, because we compress the analogies between the days to an identity in the blend and the disanalogies to change for that blend, we have a compact, compressed little blend. And we know that we're not deluded. We don't think that every day repeats exactly what happened the day before, but we can now use it. We can say the day is going to start over. Note that no day starts over. We can say dawn is coming around again. It's time for my morning coffee. Think about that. It's a miracle. Where is my morning coffee? What could my morning coffee be? Notice my morning coffee exists today, even if I didn't have it. If I say this part closes at dusk, you don't say, and when will it close? Tomorrow. Because I've made a comment about the blend, the cyclic day. And notice that these conceptions are not inherently linguistic. You have to have the meaning in order to want to express it. So on our list of things you need to be able to do if you're going to develop language and understand other people's languages, you have to be able to make form-meaning pairs. And yes, other species have some, species-wide. And human beings may have some few of these themselves, but the human being can take things that are forms, sounds, visual elements, gestures, a touch, a form, something that's perceptible in our perceptual fields, and connect it to a meaning and get a form-meaning pair. So if you think of drawing, this is Harold in the purple crayon. He made a long straight path so he wouldn't get lost. Notice that we say there's Harold. Now, of course, that's not Harold, right? That is a form-meaning pair. And in the blend, they're compressed. We're not deluded. We don't think that that little drawing of Harold could actually start walking. And it's also amazing that that line, it looks like the horizon, and that this thing that's got an angle in it is a long straight path. And of course, there's a moon. And what happens in this, of course, is you have vital relations which are compressed, like representation links, but also sometimes you have various kind of analogy links so that the topology of the moon and the topology of the drawing might share. Well, this is what you need. You need to be able to make form-meaning pairs. Now, the form and the meaning are radically different. They in different categories, right? And many, many people have pointed this out for thousands of years. You need to have a sound or a word, a squiggle, a picture, something that prompts you to call up meaning, form, meaning, pairs. So you have to have a system that can let you do that. And we could just stipulate that system. Say, well, human beings can do this. Sure. But why can they do this? And why can they do this with a capacity that leaves other species completely in the dust? And the answer is, in blending, this is nothing special. We see this being done all over the place in things that are not linguistic. This is a general ability widely evidenced in all kinds of human fields. And it happens to be able to let us make form meaning pairs for
Mark,
linguistics. Yeah. Yes.
There are people are asking you about the slides. Are you sharing the slides?
Of course I am.
But we can't see it.
You can't see it. Well, let me go and we were sharing them before, so I'll just go here to Zoom and we'll share the screen. Yeah, it says I'm sharing, but I will share it again. And where are we? Here we go. Share the screen. Bang.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
Is this better?
Yes. Yes.
Great. So we will, I'll just show you a bunch of slides. This is what you've been missing. Nick Infield's slide. There's Gilles Fauconnier. This is a good little pause. Literary mind. 8th chapter, The Literary Mind. Cognitive Dimensions of Social Science. Origin of Ideas. The Role of Blending. Popel's talk. Neurobiological Substrates. Michael Tomasello's talks and the compatibility, Steven Pinker and all he has done, and the kinds of things that I have found compatible in his current work. And so the question here is, has blending theory become mainstream? Certainly, if you look at something like Ronald Laniker, he indeed seems to think so. And I refer you to Lilian Ferrari and Mayra Avelar's presentation from a few days ago. And again, the point that I'm not trying to plant the flag and claim dominion. Knowing a community system is knowing a relational network of form meaning pairs and how they blend. Equipotentiality, here's what we need all these mental abilities for. I don't think that we have lots of separate traits, each of which is modular. On the contrary, I think that we are on a blending cline, and when we get to a certain point of double scope blending, then that makes a number of human performances possible. I also think this is the unified mental ability that lies behind a number of different products that we often satisfy. And here are just some references for that kind of claim. Here we have the cyclic day. When you compress the disanalogies to change and the analogies to uniqueness, you get the cyclic day, which has great emergent structure, right? So you need to be able to do blending of this sort. You also need to be able to make form meaning pairs where the form can be almost anything. Human beings use all kinds of forms to communicate, but you have to be able to make new form meaning pairs. And in this particular regard, we roar past other species. So we're here that you have to be able to make form meaning pairs. This is not an exceptional thing in blending, that the ability exists across a wide range of other non-linguistic performances. You have to have equipotentiality, and that's where I'm going to come to right now. So I'm picking back up. Language is possible only if it allows a limited number of blendable language forms to cover a very large number of meaningful situations. So for instance, you have to have words like food that can apply to all kinds of different things, even if it wasn't what you meant by food. Words like brown or, house, and closed class words of, and you, and various kinds of causal constructions. Now, when you have the ability to blend, you can get the following kinds of circumstance. So a child, this is attested, a child sees a termite doing something with wood and doesn't understand what's going on, right? Now, wood certainly doesn't count in the form meaning pair for the child, or indeed for me, as food. But I can say to the child, oh, the wood is food for the termite. It's termite food. Now notice I didn't, food and wood were not form meaning pair. But through blending, I can blend the person with the termite, the food with the wood, and now in the blend, and notice this is blending things that are fundamentally in conflict. You can't eat food, and it's very important that we know, you can't eat wood, and it's very important that we know that. And indeed, other species can often eat things that would be toxic poison for us, not food. But I prompt you to blend, you blend, now it's not a problem. And notice I can call it termite food. I had the word termite, I had the word food, I had nominal compounding. And so I don't need, here's the crucial part, I don't need new constructions in order to express new meaning conceptions. Sometimes I do. Think of the kid who goes to the zoo or wherever and for the first time sees a lion and says, kitty. And this charms the adults and they laugh, right? We would not call it a kitty, but we know that the child has a form meaning pair, kitty being the form, and it calls up a certain meaning, and the child is blending the meaning of the kitten with the lion and using the form that is available to prompt for the blend. This is extremely common. Here's an analysis of the way in which here and now, other deictics and indexicals are used in English and Russian when you enter into a new scene like TV news. They do get used in slightly different ways with new blends. This article says that these words acquire slightly different sets of distributions for TV news, blended classic joint attention. And blending is what makes this possible. We don't notice it, but it's very, very important. You can see a long analysis of ways in which you use equipotentiality is made possible through blending in this very early article by Fauconnier and Turner, 1996. You can download it from my website. You can see a much fuller review of equipotentiality as it operates in linguistics and blending in language and communication, Turner 5 years ago. So we need to be able to make form meaning pairs. My analysis is blending already gives you what you need for that. We need to have equipotentiality for things like food. This is largely equipotentiality, what other species don't have. The inability to, they have an inability to use the forms they know, even like Hanzi, to express vast ranges of new meaning that are not here and now, that are not part of the normal environment. It may have been years ago, maybe years in the future, that are in domains that are abstract. And we see this in human beings all the time. I'll just give you one example. So and all of construction grammar knows that we need to be able to unify, combine, or put together constructions in order to come up with expressions, constructs. This is what construction grammar says. Well, in yoga, there is an analysis, you're all familiar with this, according to which breathing is causal. And if there's a cause-effect relationship between the motion and the movement, or between the breath and the quality of the features of the body part, well, then you can, in very standard form, project the verb from the space of the breathing, and it becomes merged with causation. So it's not at all strange in a yoga class for someone to say, inhale your leg strong. So the Swami says this, or exhale your leg to the mat. This is well recognized in construction grammar. We blocked him from the door means that uses the cause motion causal construction, but puts in an entirely opposed verb for a blend in which what you're doing is stopping the motion instead of causing it. He knitted his way across the Atlantic. She denied him that courtesy, where you get the ditransitive, not for the transfer of something, but for the refusal to transfer. These are pretty visible to people, but what I want to say is that this kind of operation blending is going on all the time. It's what makes language and communication possible, that first you can have a form-meaning pair, and now you can blend the form-meaning pairs into constructions, and this sometimes gives you, sometimes, not often. In termite food, we didn't need new syntax. Of course, it's an explanation, or it's a story to explain where nominal compounds come from. Gilles and I have tried to do that, to explain that nominal compound is itself a blend that puts together different kinds of forms into a new kind of form. The example I'll give here comes from Fillmore, who pointed out what he called associated syntax, and which I call blended syntax. So you can load the hay on the truck, and you can fill the truck with hay, but fill goes with. And this provides you the instruments you need as inputs to a blend in which you can load the truck with hay, and you understand that that means the truck is filled. If I take a little bit of mud and smear it on the wall, I can't say I smeared the wall with mud. That's not very appropriate. I could say I smeared mud on the wall, but if I smear the wall with mud, your tendency is to interpret that as I pretty much covered the wall, exactly because you have blended syntax using the with from another construction. And there's a very long analysis of risk, which I refer you to. Risk involves constructions for chance and harm and choice, but you can bet on, you can invest in, and you can expose to. And so we end up with, you risk your boat to the waves because it's exposure, you risk your money in the stock market, and you could risk your money on a horse. Blended syntax, sometimes you do get new syntax, new forms can come up. We also need to account for mistakes. It's probably a mistake to call them mistakes. They're all over the place, but they're not unmotivated. Blending analysis takes the view that these mistakes are frequently cases where you had various kinds of constructions that were plausible for expressing what you wanted to say. So I've worked for 45 years on what I call the XYZ construction. That car is the Mona Lisa of automobiles, something like that. Notice the W is not mentioned. I don't have to mention art. That car is the Mona Lisa. That car is the automobile equivalent of the Mona Lisa. That car is the automotive equivalent of the Mona Lisa. That car is the equivalent of the Mona Lisa. That car is the automotive Mona Lisa. So look at 5 and 6. They're very, very close. And so do you get a blend of these two available expressions because the constructions go together so well? Do you get something like the car, that car is the equivalent of the automotive Mona Lisa? Now, I run a huge big data science lab, Red Hen Lab with Francis Steen, for getting data, organizing data, searching data, testing hypotheses against data. So I went looking, and the answer is, I did not go looking for automobiles or Mona Lisa. What I went looking for is the noun phrase is the equivalent of noun phrase, where you have the adjective in the right spot. And let's see.
Elevated this. It set a record, and it elevated this industry to investor class. I mean, why go to gold when you can go to cars?
That's right. You know, that car is the equivalent of the automotive Mona Lisa.
So you see, there it is. Now we are able to make claims in blending that we should see certain kinds of forms, certain blends of constructions, and then we can check whether or not they exist. And in various articles, I've done this for a number of other kinds of forms. What I would say is that languages change. Mistakes happen, and new forms come up, and they stick sometimes because there's uptake. And what we need is a theory. If we're going to have a theory of language and the mental abilities that make language possible, that theory has to have in its basic operations change, and change of the right sorts, because we know that's what language does, this kind of dynamism. of particular sorts is exactly what languages does, and a theory of language has to have that built into the theory, and blending theory means to do that. So knowing a communicative system is knowing a relational network. Notice you can get new constructions by blending different inputs. So here's a case of a tutorial, and notice she's going to use the word there and here in ways that were not previously possible.
If you have any questions about getting the data from your old hard drive to your new hard drive, we made a video for you that covers the process, and we will link to it right there.
Now, you happen to know that in the massive blend of blended classic joint attention that is online video tutorials, there's a production team, there are various kinds of technical abilities. You know that the here was probably put in post-production. You also happen to know that various kinds of symbols like this is what I mean, or here's what you're looking for, can be hot links on the internet that you can click on it and it will take you somewhere. So that particular form that she is pointing to, actually she's not pointing to it, she's pointing and then the team put it in afterward. You understand because you have a new form meaning pair of clickability. You also have the blend of the performing spokesperson who can command the production team to do various things. And because of that, you can now use this form here in an extended way that has never been used before. So we have analyses of these and lots of other things. Now, other folks have, in some cases, talked about paying down the loan. Notice I said if we just stipulate that people can do this, sure, we can stipulate that people can do things, right? But what we want is an analysis. We want to pay down the loan, not just say that they can do it so they have theory of mind, but where does that come from? Answers that I'm not very fond of are there's a module that we have for theory of mind or for move alpha or something like that. Nick Enfield's slides, we're looking for a more general analysis. Well, if you look at construction grammar and attribute value matrices, Chuck Fillmore, Paul Kay, things like that. Many of you have seen these kinds of attribute value matrices and combinations of them. So here's trout relish worms. This is a very funny one that Chuck Fillmore put together a long time ago. And notice, of course, what they're saying is that you have to be able to unify constructions in a certain way. We all know you can do that, but the question is, why can you do that? What is the non-linguistic specific operation that makes it possible for you to do that? Well, an attribute value matrix is what in graph theory is known as a directed acyclic graph. And you can unify different directed acyclic graphs, which would mean constructions, by taking the most general graph that includes all of the information that is in both inputs. This is the basis of attribute value matrix unification. There's also merge in minimalist theory, which is essentially a notational variant of directed acyclic graph unification. But one, what is the cognitive basis for stipulating that we can do this kind of unification? You could say, well, there's merge, or you could say, well, there's directed acyclic graph unification. So there are two reasons I have a problem with that. The first is it's not trying to ground this ability in a non-linguistic specific ability. Whereas I ground it in blending, which is highly robust, for which there's tons of evidence, lots of different systems, some generic integration templates that one learns in life and applies again and again and again. I'm trying to push us to account for this stipulation, that is to pay down the loan. And secondly, I argue that DAG unification, attribute value matrix unification, and merge are really, really good if what you want to do is make natural language processing systems. And I love computational natural language processing systems. I run them all the time. I install them on my servers. They're indispensable to run HID Lab. We use Stanford Core NLP. We use FLAIR. We use memory-based shallow parser. They're terrific, but they're pretty poor as theories of human linguistic ability because they don't have the kind of selective projection and emergent property and change phenomena that you get essentially for free in blending, right? So we have to pay down that loan, and that's what I'm trying today. So cognitive grammar has many, many impulses and analyses that I think are quite sympathetic to blending theory, all of them going in the direction of more general cognition as a basis for human abilities in language. And I will not go through this, but just mention that in chapter 9 of The Way We Think, and in other places, Shiful Konye and I go through giving a blending theory analysis of the origin of language. Language is tough to explain because it's a singularity. We don't actually have any evidence that they're simpler languages. And then 10,000 years later, a slightly more complicated language. I mean, if you look at all the world's languages, they're all complicated, and they're all equally complicated. They're just and we don't find in other species, something that has sort of half of what human language is, but not the other half. And we think that's because the singularity of language actually arises out of a continuity of change and increase in blending capacities. It's been going on since early mammals, but once you get to double scope blending, then you have the materials that you need to create form meaning pairs, to blend them into constructions, and to make new form meaning pairs. The child has this, and once you have it, you're going to get a run up to full language very, very quickly, which is what we see in human beings, and that, as far as we can tell, is exactly what happened. I only wish I had a time machine. But you can see that long argument. I won't go through any of these slides, but you can see that long argument in chapter 9 of The Way We Think. So let us skip through that. Now, here's something one could say about blending theory as a program, and I'm really sympathetic to this. So blending theory is in its infancy. It only started in 1994. Very unlike analyses of like metaphor, which are there as far back as we can trace any kind of attention to language. These analyses are relatively new. And so you could say, well, people can blend things mentally in interesting ways, and this has foundational importance in art, music, religion, social cognition, mathematical insight, scientific discovery, language, fashion, gesture. And one answer to this could be, well, okay, so we always knew that, right? To which I would say, well, okay, if we all knew that, as blending theory is becoming more mainstream, then what we need is a science of how it works. What are the constitutive principles? What are the optimality constraints? What are the patterns of compression that come up again and again and are likely? What are the techniques of blending things that are fundamentally compatible in their frame structures, such that you get emergent structure in the blend that is not cut or paste from the inputs? How does that work, right? What we need is a project. For me, this was sort of the analogies I would say is, one could have said long ago, in fact, Aristotle did say, well, forces in the world move objects around and they interact. And we could just call this Newtonian mechanics because, yes, we know that that's true. What we want is a science of how that happens. We could say life has a lot of variety. There are plants with leaves like this and plants with leaves like that. Yes, that's true. But what we'd like to know is the system behind it that in fact produces this kinds of variety, not others, which ones are possible, which ones are not possible. We can say, what is there to explain about vision? People can see. This is stipulating a power for the human being. Indeed, they can. And it's incredibly complicated. It's much more complex than we thought it would be. It's pretty much not anything like what we thought it would be. Just the analysis of color constancy and how people attribute color to the world is remarkable. So we need vision science. You could say small stuff combines into more stuff with new properties. You know the joke, never trust atoms because they make up everything. Yes, but what we would like to have is a science of chemistry that explains how this works. And so when I say, has blending theory become mainstream in linguistics, really want to make it clear, I'm not trying to plant the flag and claim dominion or ownership. On the contrary, there's a ton to be done, and many people are doing it. Instead, what I'm trying to do is just move science forward. And I think that science will move forward, be helped to move forward by looking, Nick Enfield's slides, by looking at general mental operations that are not exclusively linguistic, that could have been exploited to make it possible for human beings to have the singularity of language phylogenetically and to develop it ontogenetically in real time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. We have a few questions for you.
Okay.
There are people from all over Brazil, from São Paulo, from Rio, from Rio Grande do Norte, Rio Grande do Sul. And the first question, in fact, is from Maíra.
Hello, Maíra.
And she asks, can we say that your development of blended classic joint attention overcome this issue of considering shared joint minds? How could we see these evolutionary issues raised by Tomasello on this recent formulation of yours?
Yeah, so what I will say is in The Origin of Ideas, I summarize my view of Tomasello's stipulation. And in fact, it quotes articles that I had published much earlier about the time that I had had these conversations with Michael Tomasello. I think Michael Tomasello is a brilliant psychologist, always has been. He is quite right that human beings have advanced social cognition in certain kinds of ways. His work in distinguishing cognitively modern human abilities for understanding other minds from that of other species, pan troglodytes or great apes of various sorts, or other great apes of various sorts, is excellent. He's got a lifetime devotion to studying children, diary studies, to studying other species, dogs. We're very much better off for having these theories there. The point is that one could say, well, human beings have this kind of advanced social cognition. My analysis in The Origin of Ideas, it's the easiest place to get it, it's been around for a while, is that theory of mind at the human level is not a separate modular system. On the contrary, double scope blending hits and it makes things very, very different. Other species can have some conceptions, as Tomasello has demonstrated repeatedly, conceptions of other minds that work in certain kinds of ways, but not in the ways, and not in some of the ways that human beings work. And we've been surprised sometimes at what those other species can do. But for the human being, you look at a conspecific, and it's not just a conspecific. It doesn't have to be a human being. It could be a dog. In fact, it could be a train. It could be a house. You can look at those things and you find links of similarity or analogy between them. And those are inputs. But now you can blend them. You can say that, this thing looks like I do. This thing performs operations the way I do. If I were doing that, what I would be doing is so-and-so. I would be trying to communicate. I would be demonstrating pain. I would this and that and the other. So now in the blend, what you have is another object that can operate. but it has something that you only know of yourself. That is, it has a mind. There's a mind behind that. Human beings have no direct access whatever to the minds of other human beings. What we have is wonderful, and there are lots of different sources of it, but it is all indirect. And in the blend, I project to you what I can't know of you, namely that you have a mind, that you have a viewpoint, that like me, you can try to see what somebody else is seeing. You want to take their viewpoint. You're directed by their viewpoint. So you can build up joint attention. And then the next step is classic joint attention, where you can be communicating about the thing that you're jointly attending to in your perceptual field. Hey, Billy, look, that blackbird in the hedge has a red stripe on its black wings, right? This classic joint attention, indispensable for human learning. And however, that scene of classic joint attention, it can now be an input to yet bigger blending networks. So you can, for instance, be on the telephone. That's not a scene of classic joint attention, but you can use the scene of classic joint attention to help you understand what's going on. And you can export, you can project constructions from your understanding of the frame of classic joint attention so that you can now express things about the scene of blended classic joint attention, which might be very, very different from a scene of classic joint attention. Think of writing a letter. And in fact, new forms come up. Francois Recanati analyzed what he called the epistolary present. He does it in French, but someone writing can say, I have your question before you, and you have my answer before you. And notice they're using the present tense for moments that are clearly not synchronous, right? You know, up in the input spaces, I mean, you could have said, the writer could have said, I have your question before me, and by the time you reach, this letter reaches you, you will have my answer before you. You could have done it in an uncompressed way. But in the scene of blended classic joint attention, you can use the present for the blend, right? Many, many, many such forms. I have a paper called Blended Classic Joint Attention and Multimodal Forms, constructions for prompting blended classic attention. You, Mayra, yourself has done excellent work in this field of blended classic joint attention. So yes, what I do want to say is what Tomasello stipulates you definitely do need, and his analyses I recommend to everyone. However, the question of where theory of mind comes from is not something where we're limited to waving a magic wand and saying, I don't know, a module got planted in and I don't know how it works and I don't know where it is. And no, double scope integration allows human beings to take the kinds of interactions that other species have and move them not just to some kind of understanding of the conspecific or something else, but to a much, much richer understanding of those other minds. Notice, by the way, that we don't have any difficulty. Have you ever felt that when you come home to your house, it missed you, or that your car is refusing to cooperate with you? You know, you're not crazy. If the psychiatrist came and said to you, wait, do you really think that there's a spirit in the car that's disagreeing with you? You'd say, no, of course not. But you can get angry, you can kick the tires, things like that. The blend is very helpful. And this blend of other minds is used all over the place for human beings, but it's not a different, separate modular mechanism. It's double scope integration.
Okay. Related to that, so as for social cognition, you would say that imitation is dependent upon blending?
This is a very, very important point. So if you take something like mirror neurons, if they exist, and I'm not dismissive, what you find is, of course, there's robust evidence that a lot of species are able to see another agent, especially their kind of motion, what they do in order to pluck an apple or get something out of a bowl or something, and to make a kind of blend of themselves and the other things. They imitate. Notice it doesn't have to be just a conspecific. If I want, for instance, to smash something open, and I don't know how, and I see the limb of a tree fall off, and it falls on the coconut and it smashes the coconut open. Bravo. This can be, we're imitating. We've seen something. This is really good. But I want to point out something. This already takes for human beings, when they're doing, advanced tool use or something like this, it already takes blending. For one thing, you have to be able to blend yourself in the tree that's dropping a limb. And now in the blend, you can't do what the tree can do. You can't release a limb, right? You have to do something else. You have to take something, so you're not really imitating. And you also have to understand that that other thing and you can blend as an agent in the sense that you can take functionality from each of them and cause and effect from each of them and produce it. So Aristotle said that human beings are the most imitative of species. That's true. Other species can imitate. Parrots and cockatoos, for instance, can be entrained with music to have a certain kind of tempo. All birds that need to imitate other birds' songs would find that very useful. It seems to evolve. But human beings can do this across the range of all of the content domains, and they can do it quite richly. And that's because they have a greater blending ability. They got to the point where they have double scope integration, which is taking things that are in fundamental conflict that you should never confuse, that have conflicts at basic frame structure, causal, intentional, participant structure, modal structure, and so on, and put them together not just despite the fact that they conflict. The central conflict in many ways prompts the human being to be able to put together a blend. Imitation goes way back in species. It was there for blending to help. And so, as I frequently say, blending itself is really, really small. As far as I know, double scope, that level of integration has been available for 50,000 years, 60, 70, 80, 90, maybe 100, depending on what you find in Bloombo's cave and Border cave. We're all dependent upon what the archaeologists find in the record. I don't have a time machine. I wish the National Science Foundation would give me one. But when double scope blending came in, it wasn't just you had all these other abilities like rudimentary mirror neuron, imitation of action. Blending changed all of them, but they all had to be there in order for us to operate. So I say blending is something that's very small. It's a tiny change, double scope blending, but it's the tipping point. It's a thing that makes tremendous difference. So I'm all for analyses of imitation in other species, but I'm with Aristotle. Human beings are the most imitative of species, and the reason for that is double scope blending.
Okay. Another question from Aira. Regarding mental spaces and grammar, we also have Eve Switzer's book, Mental Spaces and Grammar. Do you think that this book covered these issues raised by Ron Langeker?
I think that Eve Switzer's book is spectacular. She also did an edited volume with Gilles Fauconnier. I was present at the time. And I think that when I said there's a long range of linguists that I might mention who are highly sympathetic in their analyses to blending theory as a non-linguistic specific basic mental operation that was indispensable for language abilities, I think she completely agrees, and she would be sort of at the top of the next set of linguists that I would bring in. I think she not only agrees, I think she has made major theoretical contributions to that argument. And everybody should go and read that book.
Okay. I agree. Leticia Salorenzo asks, Professor, an anthropologist affirms that the word mother is cisnormative and excludent. When you think of persons that have kids but not give birth to them or not breastfeed them, what do you think?
Yeah.
A related question. The category mother can be changed throughout languages and cultures in order to reach that inclusiveness?
Absolutely. Now, I want to say something, and that is when I teach linguistics, I point out to students that science has to look at everything. And a lot of what exists might be very unpleasant in many different ways. But the botanist wouldn't be a botanist who said, I'm only going to look at pretty flowers. I'm not going to look at stinking weeds, because there's a system behind all of this. And any form meaning pairs we put together can be used by anybody, equipotentiality, to express all kinds of things, a whole lot of which we'll just disagree with or find offensive or something like that. And the fact that you do find it offensive indicates how strong the power of these blended constructions is, because if you didn't understand it, it would not evoke sorrow or resistance or something like that. So I pick whatever kind of discourse you find most indefensible. You will see in it the kinds of operations that are used in the kind of discourse that you think is the most laudable. These form meaning pairs and blending to create performances that prompt other people to think, if I had performed in that way, why would I have done it? And then they get together the blending network of form meaning pairs that have blended into that performance, and they try to understand what you mean. And they're very often offended. Now take something like mother. Yes, we can do a lot with that. In fact, my first book was called Death is the Mother of Beauty. It's a quotation from Wallace Stevens. I have long analyses in that book. And indeed, Gilles and I have further analyses in other books of the kinds of things that you can do with kinship terms. Now, some of them you will find quite offensive, and they have been used. Some of them you will maybe in the service of inclusion or goals that you find laudable. But the point is, they're all using the same mental processes in order to produce these kinds of changes. There are a lot of contested concepts, and one of the ways that we have of dealing with contested concepts is to try to persuade people to use constructions in a certain way as opposed to other kinds of constructions. And who you are and what your context is will make a big difference on what kind of voice you can have in these discussions. What I will say is belief and understanding are two different things. When somebody says something that you find completely offensive and wrong, you still understand it, right? That's part of why it's offensive and you want to resist it. The fact that you know certain constructions, that you know certain form meaning pairs, that you know that they get used in some ways, just means that you're a native speaker of the language. Doesn't mean you believe in those kinds of connections. And for anthropologists and linguists, it will always be a struggle to try to indicate that people who speak in a way that we don't speak are not a different species. We always try to demonize those with whom we disagree. So I would go back to a brilliant talk that Shauna Coulson gave when she was a graduate student. She's now a full professor at cognitive science at UC San Diego, on abortion rhetoric, in which she analyzed the argumentation and the mental operations, the linear scales, and so on from different sides, from trenchantly opposed opponents in the abortion debate. And there's a tendency to think that the other side has a different brain and a different way of thinking, because if they were like you, they'd think the way you are. But she very carefully went through and showed that all the kinds of things that you criticize the other side for doing, in fact, you can find in your own discourse that you think is powerful. So the big difference between analyzing how language works and our opinion of what we think is right. Is an excellent question.
Okay. We have a few questions from Ricardo Santana. The first one is conceptual blend the basis for the... The first one is in relation to the verb imagetic multimodality, what is the role of colors in conceptual mixing?
Well, so people have color constancy, and there's a tremendous amount of uniformity in human beings. The color constancy is still has parts that are unexplained, but some parts of it are well established. It's something we share with kittens, for example. There might be differences. There are some claims that certain people have 4 kinds of cones in the retina instead of 3, and that this response means that they're attributing colors slightly differently than other people do, so you can have conversations about it. It's really a marvelous field. Now, you don't have to think about human beings or language at all to think that this is a great science we have to have, but human beings of 100,000 years ago, or even Australopithecus, just already have that in place. And it is quite natural in blending for people to take things that they know, things that are at human scale, things that they understand in their perceptual fields, walking down a path from source to goal, climbing a tree, seeing that there's an apple that you can pluck, all of this embodied knowledge, which is at human scale, and to use it to understand things that are not at human scale. So it's very frequently the case that other species do impressive things. They migrate to a place to procreate, to mate, that they'd never been to. Instinct can build in a few very impressive species-wide kinds of things. And also, other species can have, I like chimps and dogs and cats, things like that, can understand things that are at a very local scale of here and now. So instinct can lead them to long-range dependencies, but they also can handle things that are sort of at the scale of that species. Now, for human being, everything is here and now. Memory does not actually open a window into the past, so it comes into your mind. Memories are here and now in your body, in your environment. The only equipment you have for thinking these vast, overarching thoughts is very, very local equipment. But we're frequently able, like as in the cyclic day, to think of things that are long ago, far away, stretch around the world, indeed that stretch across causation, agency, time, and space. Think, for instance, right now about our understanding of coronavirus and COVID-19, and what's going on in Sweden and what's going on in Brazil and the stock market around the world. Vast amounts of causation, agency, time, and space that we can compress. And we typically do that by blending it with something we know. Now, one of the things we know is color distinctions, right? So that has been an embodied knowledge, very useful for us to try to make compressions to understand things that are arch across causation, agency, time, and space. So for instance, if you look at a map and they want to show you where it's cold and where it's warm, it's not the case that if you go to a place that's cold, it has a different color, right? And on the contrary, it can be bright and sunny and sub-zero, and I mean sub-zero Fahrenheit. But if you look at the map, colors have become a way to colors, embodied knowledge is something you can blend in order to try to get people to grasp things that are not colors and that are sort of otherwise intractable. Now, there are tendencies in the optimality constraints. So for instance, if you have the idea that ice is kind of blue and fire is kind of red, it would be weird to have a map where the hot zones are blue and the cold zones are red. So you can get certain cultural kinds of constraints on these sorts of uses of perceptual patterns. But yes, the part of the reason that you can have symbols that stand for something other than themselves is exactly because you can make these kinds of form-meaning pairs through blending. And while evolution can provide some of them, and other species have them, at the here and now, the vervet monkey calls and things like that, right? Right in the here and now, species-wide. For human beings, they have the open-ended ability to make new form-meaning pairs and to see whether they can get uptake in the community.
Mm-hmm. And another question from Ricardo. Is conceptual blend the basis for the emergency of creative metaphors? How to measure the degree of conventionality of a metaphor in a conceptual verb imagetic blending?
It's an open empirical question. To what extent are things entrenched? To what extent has there been uptake? So if you look, for instance, in that article called Figure in Figurative Language and Thought, it's not really an article. It's one of 4 chapters by 4 editors. If you look at that, you will see that I say we really do need to account for the fact that people sometimes respond to something as a metaphor. They say, well, you know, Juliet is the sun is a metaphor, and a robin is a bird isn't a metaphor, it's a category. We're not dismissing that. On the contrary, that's a phenomenon, this reaction, this judgment. And so I do a lot of that. But what I say is these are different products of a unified system. They're not different systems. And I try to map out and give some examples of the kinds of conditions that will result in something being regarded as a category, as an analogy, as a metaphor, and so on. I also show that, or I think I show, that a basic metaphor is an entrenched blend where you're not doing new work in the blend, but you can say, you know, love is a journey, purposeful activity is a journey, and that is an entrenched set of ontological mappings. The vocabulary from the source has been exported historically in the language, and you are supposed to know that if you to count as a native speaker. However, you can always wake them up. That is, you can take the metaphor, however ontologically mapped it looks, and you can wake it up and start to bring in new things from the inputs, develop new emergent structure in the blend, right? So it is only the entrenched, exported part of the blend that counts as the basic metaphor. But blending is the engine that produces metaphors. It's vital relations, metonymy, analogy, allegory. All of these are just words, and I don't mind which words you use. That's not a disagreement. What we want to see is what is our analysis of the processes that are going on. And if we agree on the processes, then you can call it anything you want. And if you don't agree on the processes, then all the better. Now we have something to get evidence about and argue. So that book is an attempt to lay out the program according to which it's much more one big happy family. It is certainly the case that people have different reactions to things, but I think trying to think that that means that they have different systems of thinking that produce those things is grabbing the stick by the wrong end. And yes, all metaphor, but certainly creative metaphor, is able to exist because of double scope blending. And I would point out that if you look at even the most creative metaphor, and you actually do all the mapping, most of the projections are not metaphoric. In a lot of cases, the point is not about comprehension; it's about compression. So if you look at, you're digging your own financial grave, or if Clinton were the Titanic, the iceberg would sink, and so on. The crucial part of the understanding, the causal structure, the intentional structure, is coming not from the source; it's coming from the target. But what the source is giving you is compression. In a scene that is at human scale. So George Lakoff and I wrote a book, and in fact, that book, More Than Cool Reason, has bits about generic mapping. We point out that things like, you can have an evil musician who makes you disappear, an evil magician who the benevolent magician who reincarnates you. And of course, the point is that the only reason the magician would be benevolent or evil is that in the blend, he's working on you instead of the scarf that he makes disappear. So the evaluation comes out of the blend. It's emergent property. You can also have, time as a doctor, but you can also have money as a doctor. You can have, I mean, it's not a fixed ontological blend. And death is the mother of beauty, which was before more than cool reason. I argue that an awful lot of metaphors come about by generic constraints, not ontological mappings. The ontological mappings come later. So this will remain an open and I think highly contested area of human cognition. And I look forward to all of these discussions. I've been in them for a long time. Yes, I take the view that metaphor is a field inside blending theory.
Okay. Now we have a question from Andrea, who is an Italian PhD student in Mexico. Can we say that cognitive linguistics in this phase of development is more often generalizing than working on cultural specific level of analysis?
One always wants to see more cultural level of analysis, and there has been a paucity of that historically. We usually say that English is the most overstudied language, and it means not just English. It means places where English is one of the native or one of the formal official languages, things like that. But going back to things like Eve Sweetzer's analysis of the concept of lie, I was very pleased to see these kinds of things early because, well, think of what culture does. So other species are not so good at having culture. There are some kind, whereby culture will mean something that can be taught in such a way that it survives the person who's doing the talking. And if you look at other species like chimpanzees and so on, it's quite clear that there are a few cultural sorts of things. Dolphins can, Tursiops truncatus can learn how to use a sponge from its mother. It can learn how to do conching, where you drive the fish into a shell and then take it up to the surface and try to wiggle it to get the fish into your mouth. Wrangham is the expert on chimpanzee culture. And what we would point out about these things is the cultural things, not the instincts, not the ones that are species-wide and just come up in any sort of environment, but the things that are not species-wide are very few, they're very fragile, and they are tied to the local scale, the scale at which that species works. They're here and now. So like eating the fish out of the conch, where you have all of the scaffolding in the world for eating or reproducing or something like that. And in species, you can get small cultural sorts of things. Now, the human beings are just off the charts. They roar ahead. If you have a ringtail lemur in Madagascar and you're on one side of the mountain, the hill, and you walk over the hill to the other side of the hill, that ringtail lemur is going to have, they're going to be the same. Sure, there might be some differences, male, female, and junior, senior, and things like that, but those kinds of differences are also species-wide. There might also be differences if the other side of the mountain has a lake, because that is an ecologically prompted difference, but the ones on the other side of the hill would have those kinds of behaviors if they had a lake, right? Whereas for human beings, if you walk over the hill, they might speak differently, flirt differently, dine differently, have vast cultural differences. So the point of basic mental operations is just the fact that you have blending doesn't give you what you might think it gives you. Now you have to build it. Take something like writing, which has existed for the most 8,000 years, maybe, and how far it goes back is just, not very far. And you have to account for that, right? It had to be invented. For a long time, almost nobody was literate. We have societies now that are not literate. Nobody thinks there's a module for reading and writing, right? This is the use of pre-existing abilities. But you have to, if you have blending abilities that allow you to invent writing and reading, you still have to invent it. The culture has to hit it. And I think that in our time, I could rattle off, for instance, 100 people worldwide who are working on very culturally specific analyses. So, for instance, Levinson gave a talk in this in which he had some marvelous, highly local, highly culturally influenced analyses of these kinds of things. And what I would want to say is that in this talk, emphasizing that blending is a basic mental operation, double scope blending is a level that all human beings have, as far as we know, and have had for 50,000 years. I know this looks lumping, and it looks as if I'm saying, well, it's all the same. But in fact, the other side of the coin is having the operation doesn't give you the products. Now cultures have to do long, long work in order to generate all those kinds of products. And we need to see more analysis in blending theory of the paths in which that's gone down. One thing I would say is it seems to be very path dependent. So in French, they have double verb analytic causatives, and they put the agent of the caused action after the second verb, whereas English puts it in the middle between the two verbs. So I say, I made Paul cry. But in French, we would say, j'ai fait pleurer Paul. You put the agent who's doing the crying after the crying, whereas we tend to put it before. Well, once you get a language or a culture making a choice down certain paths, well, then the new constructions that you come up with typically take existing constructions as inputs, and we build upon what we've already got. And so that can mean that you end up with certain kinds of divergence, certain kinds of changes because of path dependence. I think path dependence in the formation of constructions is a major field and is a spot where a cultural anthropologist would be indispensable.
Okay. Now we have a question from Yassin Tazdemir. The mental blending example, inhale your legs strong on the mat, type is not possible in Turkish because we do not have resultative constructions. Do you consider typological differences for synthetic blends as well? Greetings from Turkey.
Yes, and the answer is absolutely. That's just the right analysis. When you're trying to put together a performance, you take as inputs what you have available, and if what you've got available in your language and what I've got available in my language are different, we have to find different ways to do it. So I believe, and you would tell me, that in Turkish there's got to be some way, perhaps paraphrastic, in which you could prompt somebody to think that breathing in can have an effect on the strength of an appendage, right? But maybe you don't have the constructions that I would use in English. You would have some others. And from the very earliest days of blending theory, this kind of topology was something that we hammered again and again and again. So when Gilles and I produced an analysis of double verb causatives, one of the things we say is, well, Adele Goldberg says, well, why don't you get this kind of double verb causative? And the answer is that we don't have in French the single verb clause form that you would need. You have lots of others and you get the blends off those, but for the one Adele was asking for, you don't have the input that would allow you to produce it, so you don't get the blend, right? Or Neely Mandelblatt's great analysis that in Hebrew and some other languages, you have a morphological causative, meaning that you can mark the verb with a morpheme, and now you have one word, one lexical things, that means cause to do something. So for instance, in English, I would have to say something like, the sergeant made the soldiers run, right? So it's a double verb causative, and I put the agents that are performing the caused action, the running, before the second verb. The sergeant made the soldiers run. Now she points out that in Hebrew, you would just take run and mark it with a morphological causative, and you would have sergeant, blah, soldiers, and that's fine. And that shows that different languages have different constructions at the ready. And that, as I say, is going to influence not only how you speak, but it's going to influence the new constructions or the new kinds of combinations that you can form. So I had the slide earlier about how we get very strong cultural differences around the world. And that is what you would expect, because double scope blending provides this kind of creativity. It's constrained, it's limited. Of all the possibility space, you're only going to do some of it. Most of it you're not. It's highly constrained, but you can still do it in different kinds of ways. And typology is often the analysis of the systems of different ways in which one can do it.
Okay, now we have one question from Marcia Machado. What's the role of discrete and non-discrete linguistic and non-linguistic things in blending theory? Is there an inclination to a mapping of human world reality to discrete things?
The impulse to that, I think, is very, very deep. And one of the things I want to say is blending is not a triumphal story. Wow, now you have double scope blending, so you see the truth and you have more powers. In many cases, blending leads to things that are quite false. It might be quite creative to come up with false theories. There's nothing wrong with that. You come up with a false theory and then you test it against the world and it turns out to be false. This has happened many, many, many times in science. But it was already kind of impressive that the person could come up with that sort of theory. So we have evil concepts, we have offensive concepts, we have mistaken theories, and so on. And blending is very much used in producing all of this error and all these mistakes and things like that. Human beings are very robustly creative at that. And one of the kinds of things that you can get from blending is a tendency to think that the mind and mental operations and linguistic structures are that we can understand them by making a blend with stuff that's at human scale and embodied. So you pick things up. You say, well, here's a glass, right? In fact, the science of our perceptual fields is very complicated. You're going to win the Nobel Prize if you can explain why you see that as one glass. All kinds of different things are being processed in all kinds of different ways. It's called the integration problem, sometimes the binding problem in perceptual science. Extremely difficult. It's especially even more difficult because you have object permanence. If I raise the same glass again, you think it's the same glass. How you produce that? But you do have these ideas that there are discrete things in the world and they interact in this kind of way and so on. And there are categories of things that don't overlap and so on. And it's very natural to make blends with human performance. So any linguist will, of course, show you that in the auditory stream that's being emitted by somebody, there are not breaks between words, mostly. And that, in fact, achieving a sense that one word is followed by another word is a tremendous achievement. You're doing this quite creatively, right? It's stunning examples, right? Because human beings are extremely good at separating the world into objects and events, despite the fact that in modern physics, there are no events that don't have objects and there are no objects that are not events, right? These are human categories, human scale understanding that seems to be very useful to us. And we map those sorts of things onto all kinds of conceptions. So we map, movement onto love and to passions and things like that. So it's quite natural that we would be mapping our concepts, our frames for human interaction and physical space onto linguistic mental abilities. This can sometimes, for instance, give us the idea that there are sharp categories. So for instance, there's a noun, there's a verb, there's an adjective. These are categories. And then you have to have a theory that explains when something from one category gets used as another category. So the star can twinkle, but I can also say, I twinkle the light, right? So the twinkle now becomes transitive, right? We have to have theories of this. And as far back as linguistics has gone, it's been very common to try to take discrete versus continuous in our understanding of human physical application and experience, and map that on to what's happening at the linguistic level. This is an open empirical question. There are lots of people who argue that these categories are not discrete, that they may have particular products that you can separate and find distinctions in, but at the fundamental level, they're not discrete. I view this as a large, open empirical project for all linguistics.
Okay. And the last question is a question from Tiago Torrent.
Hello, Tiago.
Given that frames are already regarded as too fine-grained for most natural language understanding tasks, and given that they are much more culturally stable and conventionalized, what's your take on what needs to be done in computational linguistics to embrace mental spaces and blends?
I think it's going to be a long, long journey, not easily achieved. As you know, you and I both work in natural language processing, computational management of expression. And we're very pleased that there are all of these wonderful natural language programs. We're grateful that my professor Charles Fillmore put together a theory of frames and launched FrameNet. And in fact, it was my lab with Francis Steen that wrote the first Python scripts to query FrameNet 1.6 at the time to just tag text for frames and to do speech to text, so they could backward tag the speech for frames. But the kinds of things that I'm talking about in this talk are frame blending, just the simplest forms of frame blending, for example, much less some of just the routine kinds of things that a human being does. The 5-year-old child who says, the guard killed the thief out of the bank, right? He's taking a verb that we wouldn't use in cause motion, but the kid can do it. That kind of stuff is very, very far away, I think, from existing computational systems, natural language systems. And I would say I do happen to know a guy who leads the major international laboratory that's trying to push this forward. And it's located in Brazil. It's called FrameNet Brazil. And that impressive researcher is named Tiago Torrent.
Okay. So Mark, thank you immensely for your talk and for your detailed and insightful answers to our questions.
Again, thank you all for your patience, for your time and attention, and great thanks to Abralin for running this entire system. It's a highlight of my life these days, and you really are helping to push science forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.